In this video, you will learn about the three major mechanisms that control hormone release. These mechanisms are humoral, neural, and hormonal stimulation. Humoral release mechanisms involve changes in the concentration of a substance called a solute in the blood or extracellular fluid. Importantly, the solute itself is not a hormone. One example of a humoral stimulus is an increase in the osmolarity of extracellular fluid leading to the release of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect changes in the overall solute concentration of the extracellular fluid. When osmolarity is too high, these hypothalamic neurons respond by releasing ADH. Another example of a humoral stimulus is the blood calcium concentration. When blood calcium concentration drops below its homeostatic set point, the chief cells of the parathyroid gland release parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone then acts on target cells to increase blood calcium levels. For example, activation of osteoclast cells releases calcium from bone. This restores homeostasis through a negative feedback mechanism. Blood glucose is a third example of a humoral stimulus for the release of hormones. Cells in the pancreas release hormones in response to blood glucose concentration. Insulin is released by beta cells of the pancreas in response to high blood glucose levels, known as hyperglycemia. Insulin stimulates target cells throughout the body to remove glucose from the blood. Glucagon is released by alpha cells of the pancreas when blood glucose levels are too low, a condition known as hypoglycemia. Target cells throughout the body respond to glucagon in order to increase blood glucose levels back to the homeostatic set point. Many target cells respond by decreasing glucose uptake from the blood. In the liver, glucagon stimulates glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis so that glucose can be released into the blood. Both insulin and glucagon are released in response to humoral stimuli, changes in the blood glucose concentration. These hormones are produced by different cells in the pancreas and work as opposite negative feedback mechanisms that counteract each other to balance blood glucose homeostasis. Next, we move on to neural stimuli. Neural stimulation occurs when a neuron releases a neurotransmitter that activates an endocrine gland to release a hormone. One example is the release of oxytocin during labor. Stretching of the cervix activates afferent neurons. These neurons relay signals to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamic neurons respond by releasing oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin causes uterine contractions. Uterine contractions increase cervical stretching. This further stimulates oxytocin release. This process is an example of a positive feedback loop. Because neural activity initiates hormone release, this is classified as a neural stimulus. Another example involves activation of the sympathetic nervous system during stress. Preganglionic sympathetic fibers innervate the adrenal medulla. These neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine stimulates cells of the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Because neurons directly trigger hormone release, this is also a neural stimulus. Finally, we have hormone release in response to hormonal stimulation. This occurs when one hormone binds to receptors of target cells within an endocrine gland to regulate release of another hormone. The hypothalamus produces hormones known as releasing hormones. These releasing hormones bind to receptors on anterior pituitary cells. This stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete other hormones. One example occurs during a long-term stress response. The hypothalamus secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH binds to receptors on cells in the anterior pituitary. This stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. The release of ACTH is controlled by a hormonal stimulus. ACTH then stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. This is another example of one hormone triggering the release of another hormone. There are several more examples of releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus that function as the hormonal stimuli for the anterior pituitary to release hormones. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, stimulates the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone, or LH. GnRH also stimulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, stimulates the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. Prolactin-releasing hormone stimulates the secretion of prolactin. Growth hormone-releasing hormone, or GHRH, stimulates the release of growth hormone. As we continue studying endocrinology, you will see many examples in which one hormone stimulates the release of another. To recap, hormone release is regulated by three main mechanisms using humoral, neural, or hormonal stimuli. Humoral stimuli are changes in blood chemistry, such as glucose or calcium levels. Neural stimulation occurs when neurons directly stimulate endocrine glands to release hormones. Hormonal stimuli are hormones that trigger the release of other hormones. Together, these mechanisms allow the endocrine system to respond precisely to changes in the body and maintain homeostasis.